Get your filthy farm animals away from my pristine lawn, or I'll have them put down. I run this community, and I will not have it turned into some backwoods petting zoo by the likes of you." The words, sharp as shrapnel, tore through the quiet morning air. I stood on my own property, a solid 10 feet from the invisible line that separated my acreage from the manicured postage stamp of a yard belonging to the woman currently turning a shade of crimson I'd previously only seen in signal flares. This was Karen, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, a woman whose physical presence was as substantial as her sense of entitlement. She was pointing a trembling, sausage-like finger at Daisy and Buttercup, my two Nigerian dwarf goats, who were placidly munching on a patch of kudzu I'd been trying to eradicate for a year. They were ecological lawnmowers, not a threat to national security. I looked from her quivering face, contorted with a rage that was almost theatrical, to my goats, then back to her. My hand, resting on a fence post I'd sunk myself, didn't so much as twitch. After 3 tours as an Army combat engineer, a screaming HOA president, barely registered as a threat, but the sheer audacity, the casual threat to harm my animals on my land, lit a slow-burning fuse deep in my gut. This wasn't just a complaint, it was a declaration of war. If you think this is insane, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Have you ever had an HOA nightmare like this? You won't believe where this goes. I'd bought this land, all 120 acres of it, as a promise to myself, a promise of peace. After 2 decades of living on military bases, in cramped quarters, and in dusty, hostile landscapes, the dream of open space was the one thing that kept me going. When I retired, I sank every penny of my savings and a good chunk of my pension into this sprawling tract of rolling hills in old-growth forest in rural Tennessee. It was called the Holloway Grant, an old land patent from the 1800s that had remained mostly intact. Tucked away in the northeastern corner, however, was a 50-acre carve-out, a subdivision called Oakwood Estates that had been developed in the late 1980s. The developer had signed a 40-year ground lease for that parcel, building about 60 single-family homes on it. When I bought the Holloway Grant, I didn't just buy the woods and the fields. I bought the land underneath every single one of those houses. I became their landlord, in the most literal foundational sense of the word. The ground lease agreement, a dense inch-thick document my lawyer and I had spent a week dissecting, was now my property. The developer's corporation had long since dissolved, and the HOA had become the de facto successor entity responsible for upholding the terms of the lease. For the first year, it was perfect. My wife Sarah and I built a modest but solid home on a ridge overlooking the valley, far from the subdivision. We had our space, our quiet, and the gentle rhythm of the seasons. The goats, Daisy and Buttercup, were Sarah's idea. They were a chemical-free way to manage the invasive species creeping in at the edges of the old pasture land that bordered the back of the subdivision, a buffer zone that was indisputably part of my 70 acres, not their 50. And that's where the trouble started. Karen's house was one of the few that backed directly up to my property line. Her pristine lawn, which she apparently watered with holy water and guarded with the ferocity of a dragon, ended precisely where my untamed pasture began. I had made sure of it, walking the line with the original survey maps the day we closed on the property. My goats had no interest in her chemically treated, unnaturally green carpet. They were gourmands of poison ivy and wild brambles. But their very existence seemed to be a personal affront to Karen's vision of suburban perfection. Her initial salvos had been passive-aggressive notes tucked into my mailbox, written in a florid, looping script on pastel stationery, complaining about unpleasant odors and livestock noises. I'd ignored them. This, however, was a direct, face-to-face confrontation, and her threat against my animals crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, letting her fury crash against my calm. "Ma'am," I said, my voice low and even, "these goats are on my property. They are contained by a fence, and they are performing a specific task. They are not your concern." Her face purpled. "Not my concern? I am the president of this HOA. Everything in this community is my concern. You will receive a formal notice of violation. The fines will be immediate and substantial. "We have covenants," she screeched, the word covenants sounding like a sacred incantation. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You do that," I said, my voice betraying nothing. I turned my back on her, giving Daisy a scratch behind the ears. The goat let out a contented bleat. Behind me, I heard a strangled gasp of indignation, followed by the sound of Karen stomping back toward her perfectly manicured prison. The fuse in my gut was still burning, slow and steady. She thought she was fighting a battle over aesthetics and rules. She had no idea she was standing on my land, threatening my family, and in doing so had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. The promised envelope arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail, a clear escalation in our one-sided war. It wasn't just a letter, it was a portfolio of perceived infractions, a thick, heavy packet that felt dense with self-importance. I sat at the solid oak table in our kitchen, the morning sun slanting across the wood, with Sarah pouring us both a cup of coffee. The sheer weight of the thing was almost comical. Inside, bound by a staple that seemed to be straining under the pressure, was a 12-page document titled Official Notice of Covenant Violation and Schedule of Fines. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, filled with pseudo-legal jargon and references to bylaws and articles. Karen, or whoever she had composed this screed, had thrown everything at the wall. I was cited for harboring non-domesticated agricultural animals, failure to maintain property in accordance with community aesthetic standards, creating a public nuisance, and my personal favorite, olfactory pollution. The fines were staggering, $1,000 for the initial violation, with a compounding penalty of $100 for every day the nuisance was not abated. According to her math, I already owed them $1,300. The notice concluded with a summons to an HOA Architectural Review Committee hearing in 2 weeks' time, where further sanctions, including the placement of a lien against my property, would be considered. Sarah read it over my shoulder, her lips a thin, tight line. "A lien? Can she do that?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with steel. Sarah was a nurse, a woman who dealt with life and death situations with a steady hand, and she had even less patience for this kind of petty tyranny than I did. "She can try," I said, tapping the thick stack of paper. "This is designed to scare people, to make them fold immediately because it looks official and overwhelming." I took a long sip of my coffee. But she made a critical mistake. She assumes her authority extends to my front door. She thinks this land, I swept my hand toward the window, indicating the vast expanse of woods and fields, is just an oversized lot within her little kingdom. I stood up and went to my office, a room lined with bookshelves holding everything from military engineering manuals to local history tomes. From a locked file cabinet, I retrieved the two most important documents concerning my ownership of the Holloway grant: the deed itself and the 40-year-old ground lease agreement for the Oakwood Estates parcel. I spread them out on the table next to Karen's puffed-up notice. The contrast was stark. One was a document of enduring substance, rooted in law and history. The other was a piece of temporary, self-aggrandizing fiction. "When I bought this place," I explained to Sarah, pointing to the survey map attached to the lease, "the lawyer I hired, David Chen, was meticulous. He said the dual nature of the property, owning it all, but with a tenant subdivision on part of it, was unusual and could be a source of conflict. I traced the boundary line with my finger. It was clear and unambiguous. The 50 acres of Oakwood Estates were defined by metes and bounds, a precise legal description. Everything outside that line was mine, unencumbered by any HOA. The covenants she's citing," I continued, flipping through the HOA's own bylaws, which I'd obtained as part of the due diligence before my purchase, "apply only to the lots within the property, and the property is legally defined as the 50 acres described in the ground lease, not an inch more. My land, the original Holloway grant, was a separate parcel. My house wasn't in Lot 17, it was the Holloway grant. The goats weren't in a backyard, they were in a pasture on a different, legally distinct piece of land. Karen's entire case was built on a foundation of sand. She was trying to enforce the rules of a swimming pool on someone standing in the middle of the ocean. My response wouldn't be a plea for mercy or an argument about how cute the goats were. It would be a lesson in property law. I spent the rest of the day drafting my official reply. It was short, formal, and surgically precise. It referenced the specific article in her own covenants that defined the boundaries of the HOA's authority. It included a copy of the official county survey map on which I had highlighted the property line in bright yellow. It stated in no uncertain terms that her jurisdiction ended precisely 48.7 feet from the corner of her back patio, and that my animals were a good 30 feet beyond that on my own land. I concluded by stating that her notice was legally void, that no fines were owed, and that any attempt to place a lien on my property would be met with immediate and vigorous legal action for slander of title. I made 2 copies, one for my files and one to send. The next morning, I drove to the post office and sent my response via certified mail with return receipt requested. It was a small, satisfyingly official act, a paper counter-offensive. I knew it wouldn't be the end. A woman like Karen doesn't back down when presented with facts. She sees them as a personal challenge. Her power wasn't derived from rules or laws, but from the perception of her authority, from the fear and compliance of others. I had challenged that perception. I had refused to be afraid. And in her world, that was the greatest sin of all. The fuse burned on, its flame now brighter and hotter. The crisp green and white receipt from the certified letter came back within a week, bearing a scrawled signature that was unmistakably Karen's. She had received my response. The silence that followed was, for a few days, almost hopeful. Perhaps, I thought, just perhaps, the cold, hard logic of property lines and legal documents had penetrated her fortress of self-importance. Maybe she had consulted with the HOA's lawyer, who would have surely advised her to stand down immediately. It was a foolish hope. The next salvo arrived not in the mail, but through the insidious channels of neighborhood gossip. It was Sarah who heard it first, during a trip to the local grocery store. An acquaintance from the subdivision, a woman named Carol, approached her by the produce section with a look of pitying concern. "Oh, Sarah," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm so sorry about the trouble you and your husband are having. Karen is just so worried about everyone's safety." Sarah, ever the composed professional, simply raised an eyebrow. "What trouble would that be, Carol?" Carol's eyes widened, feigning surprise that Sarah wasn't already consumed with worry. "Well, the goats, of course. Karen was telling us at the book club that they're not vaccinated and could carry all sorts of diseases. And with them being so close to the children's play areas, well, she's talking about having to call animal control to have them declared a public health risk." The lie was so blatant, so malicious, it was breathtaking. My goats were healthier than most people, with a file an inch thick at the vet's office to prove it. They were also nowhere near a playground. But the truth didn't matter. Karen was poisoning the well. She couldn't beat me on legal grounds, so she was trying to turn me into a pariah, to isolate us and paint us as irresponsible, dangerous outsiders. This was her real weapon. Not bylaws, but social pressure. The smear campaign was just the beginning. A few days later, a second official-looking envelope arrived. This one was thinner, more direct. It was a final notice before lien, informing me that since I had failed to cure the violation or pay the outstanding fines, which had now ballooned to over $2,000, the HOA was formally proceeding with placing a lien on my property for the full amount, plus legal fees. It completely ignored my certified letter, as if it had never existed. Attached was the notice for the mandatory HOA hearing. It was no longer an architectural review committee meeting, but a full board of directors executive session. My presence was required. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver. When your facts are weak, you escalate the process. You create more paperwork, more meetings, more official-sounding titles to create an illusion of power and inevitability. I started a new file labeling it HOA Correspondence. Everything went in, her letters, my replies, the postal receipts. I took daily time-stamped photographs of Daisy and Buttercup in their pasture, clearly showing their location relative to the distant houses of Oakwood Estates. I mounted a small, discreet security camera on a tree overlooking the fence line, a silent, impartial witness. My military training had taught me the value of intelligence and documentation. Every conflict is a war of information. I decided it was time to do some reconnaissance. I took a walk along the public street that looped through Oakwood Estates, dressed in jeans and a simple t-shirt, just another person out for a stroll. The neighborhood was exactly as Karen would have wanted it, uniform, sterile, and eerily quiet. Every lawn was a perfect green square. Every mailbox was the same shade of beige. Every house a slight variation on the same beige theme. It was a community built on conformity. I saw a few people out gardening or washing their cars. Most offered a hesitant wave, but a few, upon recognizing me, would suddenly find something fascinating on the ground or hurry inside. The poison was working. However, as I passed a modest home with a beautifully tended rose garden, an older man looked up from his pruning. He had kind eyes, crinkled at the corners, and hands stained with dirt. He gave me a direct, thoughtful look, then a small nod. I nodded back. There was something in his expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even sympathy. I made a mental note. A few days before the hearing, I was checking the fence line when I saw him out again. This time near the edge of his property, which bordered mine. I walked over. "That's a beautiful garden you have," I said. He straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of a gloved hand. "Thank you," he said. "The wife and I have been working on it for 20 years. Name's George." "Jack," I replied, offering a hand. His grip was firm. We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken topic of Karen hanging in the air between us. "Heard you're having a bit of a disagreement with our esteemed president," George said finally, his voice low. "You could say that," I answered dryly. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Be careful, son. That woman, she feeds on this stuff. A few years back, the Hendersons, a young military family, got crossways with her over the color of their kid's swing set. Not beige enough, you see. She made their lives a living hell. Fines, threats, nasty rumors. They were good people. They ended up taking a loss on their house just to get away from her. She broke them." His words confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't Karen's first rodeo. She was a serial bully who had refined her tactics over years of unopposed tyranny. "She's trying to put a lien on my property," I told him. George's eyes widened. "On the Grant land. Not just your... Well, you don't even have a house in the subdivision, do you?" "No, I own the land the subdivision is on," I said quietly. George stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The implications of my statement slowly dawned on him. He had lived here for 2 decades, paid his dues and followed the rules, all while living on someone else's ground. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, a slow smile spreading across his face. "She picked a fight with the man who owns the whole playground." He looked from me to his own house and then back again. "Son," he said, his voice now firm, "you let me know what you need. A lot of folks around here are scared of her, but we're not all fools. It's high time someone taught that woman her place." In that moment, I knew I had my first ally. The documentation was my shield, but a community alliance, that would be my sword. The night of the HOA Board hearing was humid and thick with the scent of impending rain. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that cast a sickly yellow pallor on everything. It felt less like a community center and more like an interrogation room. Sarah was with me, her presence a silent, solid anchor. I carried a thin but heavy briefcase. As we entered, the room fell quiet. About 20 residents were scattered amongst the chairs, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile to fearful. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat Karen and her board. There were 4 of them in total, 2 meek-looking men who avoided my gaze and a woman with a severe haircut who glared at me as if I'd personally insulted her ancestors. Karen, seated in the center like a queen holding court, beamed with smug authority. She was dressed in a vibrant floral pantsuit that seemed to be at war with the room's muted tones. She called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel that was far too large for the occasion. "The first and only item on this executive session's agenda," she announced, her voice resonating with theatrical gravity, "is the continued covenant violation at the property of Mr. Jack Turner." She didn't look at me, instead addressing the room as if I were a specimen under a microscope. Despite a formal notice and ample opportunity to cure, The nuisance of agricultural animals remains. The fines have now reached $3,400. The board is here tonight to vote on the final measure, the placement of a lien against the property to secure the association's financial interests. She then launched into a prepared speech about property values, community standards, and the sacred duty of the HOA to uphold the vision of Oakwood Estates. It was a performance, and she was its star. When she finally finished, she turned to me, a condescending smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Turner, do you have anything to say for yourself before the board votes?" This was my cue. I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and placed my briefcase on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't display an ounce of anger. I simply opened the briefcase and began. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Turner." I looked not at Karen, but at the other residents. "I'm sure you've all heard a number of things about me and my agricultural animals lately. I'm here to present you with facts, not rumors." From my briefcase, I pulled out a large laminated copy of the official county survey map. I held it up. "This is the legal survey of the land this community is built on. This area," I said, pointing to the clearly marked 50-acre parcel of Oakwood Estates, "is the extent of the HOA's jurisdiction, as defined in Article 2, Section 1 of your own bylaws. And this area," I pointed to the vast adjoining space, "is my property, the Holloway Grant. They are two separate, legally distinct parcels." I then produced the time-stamped photographs of Daisy and Buttercup. As you can see from these photos, taken every day for the past 2 weeks, my goats have never left my property. They are not, and have never been, within the legal boundaries of Oakwood Estates. A murmur went through the crowd. I saw George, sitting in the back, give a subtle nod. I then placed the certified mail receipt on the table in front of Karen. "This is the receipt for a letter I sent to Ms. Albright 2 weeks ago, explaining these facts and citing the relevant legal documents. A letter which she apparently received, but chose to ignore completely." Karen's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, rigid line. "This is irrelevant procedural nonsense," she snapped. "The board has the authority—" "The board," I interrupted, my voice still calm but now carrying a new edge of command, "has the authority granted to it by the covenants, and those covenants do not apply to my land. Therefore, the violation notice is void. The fines are illegitimate, and any attempt to place a lien on my property is not just illegal, it's an act of fraud and slander of title, for which I will hold every board member here personally and financially liable." The two men on the board suddenly looked very pale. The woman with the severe haircut was now staring at Karen, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "This is an outrage," Karen sputtered, her face flushing. "The board will now vote." But it was too late. I had planted the seed of doubt, not just in the board, but in the audience. They had come expecting to see a troublemaker get his comeuppance. Instead, they were witnessing a public dissection of their president's authority. The vote was a farce. Karen and the severe-haired woman voted yes. The two men, after a moment of panicked hesitation and a venomous glare from Karen, weakly raised their hands to vote yes as well. The motion passed. "The lien is approved," Karen declared, slamming her gavel down with a triumphant crack. "This meeting is adjourned." She and her cronies practically fled the room, but the residents didn't leave. They stayed, buzzing with conversation. As Sarah and I packed up my briefcase, we were approached not just by George, but by a young couple I recognized from my walk. "Mr. Turner," the man said, extending a hand, "I'm Mark Miller. This is my wife, Jessica. What she did tonight, that was a sham." Jessica nodded, her face etched with anger. "She fined us $500 last spring because our daughter's portable basketball hoop was visible from the street for 2 hours. She threatened to foreclose on our house." George joined them, his expression grim. "She forced the widow at number 22 to rip out a whole garden of prize-winning roses because the mulch was non-compliant. The woman was heartbroken." One by one, others came forward. A quiet man who'd been fined for his satellite dish. A woman who'd been harassed for parking her son's work van in her own driveway overnight. The stories poured out, a litany of petty abuses and tyrannical overreaches. It was a pattern. Karen didn't just enforce rules. She used them as a weapon to bully, intimidate, and control. The illegal lien against me wasn't an isolated incident. It was just her latest and most arrogant escalation. Standing there in that sterile beige room, surrounded by the quiet victims of Karen's reign, I felt the conflict shift. This was no longer just about my goats or my property line. It was about them. It was about a community held hostage. She's created a record of her own abuse, I said to the small group gathered around me. And tonight she did it in public. She's overconfident, and that's how we're going to beat her. The fuse had burned all the way down. The bomb was about to go off. The day after the farcical hearing, I called David Chen, the lawyer who had handled the purchase of the Holloway grant. David was a short, impeccably dressed man in his late 40s, with a mind like a steel trap and a deep-seated loathing for bullies. When I recounted the events of the meeting, the illegal lien, and the stories from the other residents, I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. "Jack," he said, his voice brimming with a kind of cheerful lethality, "she didn't just hand you a knife. She gift-wrapped the entire armory and provided a map to her own vital organs. Slander of title is a serious tort, and doing it through a sham corporate process, that's just beautiful." He told me to immediately forward him all my documentation, the correspondence, the photos, the video from my camera, and the contact information for George and the Millers. "We're not just going to fight the lien," David said. "We're going to launch a full-scale counter-offensive. It's time to take a look under the hood of this little HOA." With David's guidance, our small alliance got to work. The first step was a formal, legally undeniable request to inspect the HOA's records, as was the right of every member under state law. Jessica Miller, as a homeowner in good standing, despite the basketball hoop incident, was the designated point person. She drafted the letter with David's help and sent it via certified mail. The request was comprehensive. We asked for all financial records for the past 5 years, bank statements, ledgers, budgets, and every single invoice and contract. We also requested the minutes from every board meeting, executive or otherwise. Karen's response was predictable. She tried to stonewall. The HOA's part-time administrative assistant sent back a letter stating that the request was overly broad and burdensome, and that fulfilling it would require an unreasonable expenditure of association resources. It was a classic delay tactic. David's reply was swift and merciless. He sent a letter directly to the HOA's registered legal counsel, a small-time local attorney who likely handled their paperwork for a flat fee. The letter pointed out that their refusal was a direct violation of state statutes, and if the complete and unredacted records were not made available for inspection within 10 business days, we would be filing for a court order to compel them and seeking sanctions against the HOA and its board members personally for acting in bad faith. The threat of personal liability and a court appearance did what Jessica's polite request could not. The HOA's lawyer, clearly not interested in a real fight, advised Karen she had no choice but to comply. A week later, Jessica and I were sitting in the same sterile clubhouse, but this time the long table was covered in dusty cardboard boxes filled with files and binders. Karen had been forced to grant us access. She stood in the corner of the room with her arms crossed, watching us with undisguised venom, as if her glare alone could incinerate the papers. We spent 2 full days poring over the records. George, a retired accountant, joined us, his sharp eyes scanning ledgers and bank statements with a practiced efficiency. What we found was worse than we had imagined. It wasn't just petty tyranny, it was systemic graft. The most glaring discovery was the landscaping contract. For the past 4 years, all of the community's landscaping and grounds maintenance, a contract worth over $60,000 a year, had been awarded without a bid to a company called Prestige Scapes LLC. A quick search of state business records on my phone revealed the owner, one Gerald Poplowski. A little more digging on social media confirmed our suspicion. Gerald Poplowski was Karen Albright's brother-in-law. We found invoice after invoice from Prestige Scapes for services that were either absurdly overpriced or completely fictitious. There were charges for seasonal aeration in the dead of winter, emergency tree removal for a tree that we knew for a fact had been taken down by a storm and cleared by the county, and thousands of dollars for planting annual flowers that we could buy at the local garden center for 1/10 of the price. The reserve funds, money that was supposed to be set aside for major repairs like paving roads or replacing the community well pump, were being systematically pillaged for Karen's vanity projects. We found the invoice for the hideous Rococo fountain she'd had installed at the front entrance, a project no one had voted for, and that had cost a staggering $25,000, categorized under Common Area Infrastructure Repair. We found records of her using the HOA's credit card for expensive dinners, claiming them as board meetings. The pattern was undeniable. Karen was using the HOA as her personal fiefdom and its treasury as her private bank account. The fines she levied weren't about maintaining standards. They were about funding her lifestyle and enriching her family. She punished her enemies, like the Millers and the widow with the rose garden, and rewarded her family, all under the guise of serving the community. We photocopied everything. Every suspicious invoice, every self-serving meeting minute, every questionable credit card statement. We built a dossier, a mountain of evidence that documented not just her abuse of power, but potential criminal fraud. While George and I focused on the financials, Jessica and Sarah worked the phones, speaking quietly to other residents, sharing what we were finding. The fear that had kept people silent began to crack. More stories emerged, more people offered to sign affidavits. The small alliance was growing into a quiet rebellion. As I packed the last of the copied documents into a box, I looked over at Karen, still standing guard in the corner. Her face was a mask of fury, but for the first time I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew we had found it. She had no idea what was coming next. This was no longer about a lien or a couple of goats. We had uncovered the rot at the core of her kingdom, and now we had the evidence to burn it all down. The discovery of Karen's financial malfeasance was the ammunition, but David Chen found the atomic bomb. He had been spending his time not with the HOA's bylaws, but with the foundational document for the entire subdivision, the original 1988 ground lease agreement between the Holloway Grant's previous owner and the developer's now defunct corporation. I sat in his polished downtown office, the file of evidence we'd compiled sitting on the mahogany desk between us. "Jack, this is the most beautifully drafted, landlord-friendly, long-term lease I have ever seen," David said, tapping a thick yellow document with his pen. The original owner's lawyer was a genius or a prophet. He slid the document across the desk to me, pointing to a specific section. Article 12, Covenants of the Lessee. It lays out the responsibilities of the entity leasing the land, which, as the developer's successor, is now the HOA. He read aloud, "The lessee shall at all times maintain the property in good order and condition, and shall not permit or commit any act that constitutes a public or private nuisance, brings the property into disrepute, or exposes the lessor to any legal or financial liability." He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming. "Her entire campaign against you, the harassment, the public arguments, the fraudulent lien is a direct breach of this clause. She's brought the property into disrepute and exposed you, the lessor, to legal liability. That's breach number 1. He then flipped a few more pages. Article 15, Management and Financial Solvency. It requires the lessee to maintain accurate financial records, remain solvent, and manage the property's funds in a prudent and transparent manner. Your audit," he gestured to my file, "proves she has done the exact opposite, funneling money to her brother-in-law, the slush fund for vanity projects. That is a massive, undeniable breach. Breach number 2. David leaned back in his chair, saving the best for last. "But here's the kicker, Jack. The kill shot." He pointed to the very first page. "It's a 40-year ground lease signed on June 1st, 1988. It has one option for a 20-year renewal. The lease specifies that the lessee must give notice of intent to renew no less than 24 months prior to expiration. If they fail to do so, the renewal option is void." My heart began to beat a little faster as I did the math. The lease was set to expire in about 18 months. "They would have needed to file for renewal 6 months ago," I said. David grinned. "Exactly, but the original lessee corporation was dissolved in 2005. The HOA, as the informal successor, probably doesn't even have a copy of this lease, let alone understand its terms. They've just been operating in a vacuum for years. I guarantee you they missed the deadline." He paused for dramatic effect. "Which means that in 18 months, the ground lease for all of Oakwood Estates expires. The land and everything permanently affixed to it, the houses, the roads, The clubhouse reverts to you, free and clear. The sheer scale of it was hard to comprehend. I could, in theory, own 60 houses. I don't want to evict 60 families, David, I said, the thought of it making me feel sick. Of course not, he agreed, and we won't have to. This isn't a cudgel to destroy the community. It's the ultimate source of leverage to save it. We don't have to wait 18 months. The lease contains a default clause. In the event of a material breach, and we have at least two massive ones, the lessor has the right to issue a notice to cure, giving the lessee a set amount of time, typically 90 days, to fix the problems. If they fail to cure the breaches, the lessor can then begin proceedings to terminate the lease immediately. The entire strategy clicked into place. It was a perfect legal trap. We didn't need to sue her for fraud. We didn't need to fight her in HOA court. We just needed to enforce the terms of the master contract that she didn't even know existed. She thought she was the queen of Oakwood Estates, but she was just a tenant in breach of her lease, and I was the landlord. So we send her a notice, I said, thinking it through. We demand she cures the breaches. That would mean the board must be removed, David finished. The financials must be turned over to a third-party auditor. All contracts with her brother-in-law must be terminated, and the fraudulent lien against your property must be expunged with a formal apology. It would be a complete and total surrender, and she's too arrogant to ever do it. And when she refuses, I said, the plan solidifying, she gives us the right to terminate the lease, which would panic every single homeowner and force them to finally remove her to save their own homes. Precisely, David confirmed. We let her arrogance be the instrument of her own destruction. We don't even have to look like the bad guys. We're just a landowner trying to protect his asset and enforce a contract. The homeowners will see that the only thing standing between their security and potential disaster is Karen's ego. We spent the next hour drafting the notice to cure. It was a cold, formal, and devastatingly precise document. It listed the breaches in excruciating detail, citing the specific articles of the ground lease. It referenced the evidence we had collected, the invoices, the bank statements, the affidavits. It laid out the non-negotiable terms for the cure, and it gave the Oakwood Estates HOA Board of Directors 90 days. Before I left his office, David had one more piece of advice. Before we send this, Jack, you need to create an undeniable visual, something that no one can ignore. You need to physically mark your territory. I knew exactly what he meant. The first shot in this new phase of the war wouldn't be a letter. It would be a line of bright pink flags marching straight through the heart of Karen's manicured illusion. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the target to walk into it. The Sunday before we sent the notice to cure was a perfect, clear autumn day. I hired a professional survey crew, the same one that had originally mapped the Holloway grant. I didn't ask them to be discreet. I asked them to be thorough. They arrived in 2 trucks with orange vests, tripods, and high-tech GPS equipment. Their presence alone was enough to draw curtains and send a ripple of curiosity through the neighborhood. Their task was simple: to mark the legal property line between my 70-acre pasture and the 50-acre Oakwood Estates subdivision, every 50 feet, with a 3-foot wooden stake topped with a bright, fluorescent pink flag. They started at the northern edge and worked their way south. The line ran behind a dozen houses, a clear delineation between my wild, overgrown land and their neat, tidy yards. But the real show began when they reached Karen's property. I stood at a distance, watching. The surveyor consulted his GPS device, then hammered a stake into the ground. Then another. The line of pink flags marched across the back of Karen's lawn, a garish, unignorable stripe of truth. It bisected her prized rose bed. It passed less than 5 feet from the corner of her new, expensive-looking composite deck. It revealed that the pristine lawn she had screamed about protecting was, in fact, at least a third smaller than she believed. A significant portion of the yard she meticulously manicured and fertilized was, and always had been, my land. The visual was devastatingly effective. It was a physical manifestation of her overreach, a bright pink scar on her perfect world. Karen came storming out of her house, her floral pantsuit replaced by a velour tracksuit. "What is the meaning of this? "Get off my property," she shrieked at the surveyors. The lead surveyor, a grizzled man named Hank, who had been doing this for 40 years, didn't even flinch. He just pointed at the ground. "Ma'am, according to the official county plat, your property ends right here," he said, tapping the stake with a boot. "This is the line. We were hired by the owner of the adjacent parcel to market." "The owner? That man with the goats?" she sputtered. "I'm going to sue you. I'm going to sue him." Hank just shrugged and moved on to the next point. The battle was beneath his pay grade. He was just there to mark the facts on the ground. The pink flags were Act 1. Act 2 was the community meeting. Working with the Millers and George, we used the HOA's own bylaws, which allowed a certain percentage of homeowners to call a special meeting. We drafted a notice and went door to door. The notice was intentionally vague, inviting all residents to a special community meeting to discuss an urgent matter affecting the future of Oakwood Estates. The rumors, fueled by the appearance of the survey crew and the line of pink flags, did the rest of the work for us. People were scared and confused. They wanted answers. We also made one other crucial call. Mark Miller had a cousin who was a reporter for the county's largest local newspaper. We gave him a tip. A small-town HOA dispute was about to blow up into a major story involving property rights and financial scandal. We told him to be at the clubhouse on Tuesday night and to bring a photographer. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was completely different from the last meeting. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with anger and suspicion. Karen and her two remaining board members, the severe-haired woman had abruptly resigned the day after the survey, citing personal reasons, sat at the front table, looking beleaguered and defensive. Karen had clearly prepared for a fight about the property line. She had a stack of her own papers in front of her. She tried to seize control from the start. "This meeting is out of order," she declared, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "But since you're all here, let me be clear. Mr. Turner's latest stunt with these stakes is a form of harassment. He is trying to intimidate me." Mark Miller, who we had designated as the meeting's moderator, stepped up to the podium. "Karen, this meeting was called by the homeowners, and we will conduct it. Mr. Turner has been invited to speak to address the community's concerns." "Jack?" I walked to the front, not with a briefcase this time, but with a laptop and a projector we had brought. I connected it, and the first image that flashed on the screen was the survey map with the pink line drawn starkly across it. "Good evening," when I began, my voice calm and steady, filling the silent room. "I know there's a lot of confusion, so I want to be as clear as possible. This isn't about harassment. It's about facts." I walked them through it, step by step. I showed them the map. I showed them the photos of the goats on my side of the line. I explained that the fines and the lien were based on a false premise. The crowd was listening intently. Then I switched slides. The next image was a copy of the landscaping contract with Prestige Scapes LLC. "But this isn't just about my goats," I said. "This is about how your community is being managed." I put up the next slide, a photo of Gerald Poplowski's smiling face from his Facebook page, standing next to his sister-in-law, Karen. A gasp went through the room. For the next 15 minutes, I laid it all out. The no-bid contracts, the inflated invoices, the fountain, the reserve funds, the credit card statements. It was a methodical, undeniable presentation of the evidence we had uncovered. With each slide, the mood in the room shifted further from confusion to cold, hard fury. People were looking at Karen, not with fear, but with contempt. "She used our money to pay her brother?" someone yelled from the back. "That fountain cost 25 grand?" another shouted. Karen was ashen-faced, shrinking in her chair. "These are lies, fabrications," she stammered, but her voice was drowned out by the angry murmurs of her neighbors. This was the moment. The public exposure was complete. "Now for the final blow." "And finally," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "there is the matter of the ground lease." I put up a slide with the key clauses from the 1988 agreement. Many of you may not know this, but the land your houses are built on is part of a lease. I am the owner of that land. Your HOA is the tenant. And the tenant, I said looking directly at Karen, is in breach of contract. David Chen, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, then walked to the front. He introduced himself as my legal counsel. As of this morning, he announced, his voice crisp and authoritative, we have delivered this notice to cure to the HOA's legal representative. He held up the document. It details the breaches of contract, from financial mismanagement to the harassment of the lessor, Mr. Turner. It gives the HOA 90 days to cure these breaches. The terms include the immediate resignation of the current board, a full forensic audit by an independent firm, and the voiding of all contracts with affiliated parties. He let that sink in. Then he delivered the final devastating sentence. Should the HOA fail to cure these breaches, Mr. Turner will be within his full legal rights to begin proceedings to terminate the master lease for the entirety of Oakwood Estates. The room exploded. It wasn't anger anymore. It was pure panic. People were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. The reporter in the back was scribbling furiously, his photographer's flash popping, capturing the image of Karen's face, which had crumpled from arrogance into sheer, unadulterated terror. She had been publicly humiliated, exposed as a cheat, and revealed as the single greatest threat to every home in the community. Her reign was over. She just didn't know how to fall off the throne yet. The scene in the clubhouse was one of utter pandemonium. Karen, for the first time in what was likely decades, was speechless. She sat frozen, a deer caught in the high beams of an oncoming freight train, as the residents she had lorded over for so long turned on her en masse. "You put our homes at risk?" a man shouted, jabbing a finger in her direction. "All for a stupid fountain and some kickbacks to your family?" People surged toward the front table, their faces masks of betrayal and fear. The two remaining board members, seeing the tide turn so violently, literally stood up, pushed their chairs back, and announced their immediate resignation before scurrying out of the room like rats from a flooding ship, leaving Karen utterly alone to face the mob she had created. Mark Miller and George had to step in to restore some semblance of order, shouting to be heard over the din, assuring everyone that the goal was not to dissolve the community, but to save it. David and I stepped aside, our part in the public detonation complete. The newspaper reporter cornered me, his pen flying across his notepad. "Mr. Turner, is it true you could effectively seize all these homes?" he asked, his eyes wide. "My only goal," I stated calmly, knowing my words would be quoted, "is to ensure the entity leasing my land abides by the terms of its contract. A contract that is designed to protect both the landlord and the residents. The future of this community is now in the hands of the homeowners." It was the truth, and it placed the responsibility squarely where it belonged. The fallout over the next few days was swift and brutal, just as David had predicted. The newspaper article ran on the front page of the county section the next morning, under the headline, HOA, President's Reign of Terror Ends in Scandal, Threatens Entire Subdivision. It featured the photo of Karen's terrified face, juxtaposed with a picture of my goats peacefully chewing cud. It detailed the financial allegations, quoted George and the Millers about the pattern of abuse, and laid out the stark legal reality of the ground lease. The story spread like wildfire. It was picked up by a regional television station. Suddenly, Oakwood Estates was infamous. Karen tried one last, desperate gambit. She called an emergency meeting of her own, plastering notices on the clubhouse door that were quickly torn down by angry residents. She sent out a frantic email blast, accusing me of being a predatory developer and a liar who was trying to steal their homes. But her credibility was utterly destroyed. No one believed her. Her meeting was attended by only 3 people, one of whom was her brother-in-law, Gerald, who reportedly spent the entire time demanding to know if his contract was still valid. Meanwhile, the legal pressure was unrelenting. David Chen was in constant contact with the HOA's shell-shocked attorney, who was now advising a complete and unconditional surrender. The threat of lease termination was the ultimate trump card. The HOA's lawyer knew they had no defense. A recall petition to formally remove Karen from the board was circulated by Jessica Miller. Within 48 hours, it had been signed by over 90% of the homeowners. Faced with total public humiliation, an impending recall, and the very real possibility of a state investigation into fraud and embezzlement, Karen finally broke. A week after the community meeting, a U-Haul truck pulled up to her house. Under the baleful glares of her former subjects, she and her husband began the pathetic process of loading their belongings. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her face was puffy, her movements slow. The vibrant, domineering queen of the beige kingdom had become a ghost, haunting the scene of her own demise. She couldn't even sell her house right away. The scandal had temporarily tanked its value. They were moving into a rental apartment across the county, a humiliating step down for a woman who had built her entire identity on being the ruler of her pristine domain. The last time I saw her, she was standing in her driveway, watching the movers load a gaudy, oversized garden gnome onto the truck. Our eyes met for a brief second across the street. There was no anger left in her gaze, just a hollow, defeated emptiness. I didn't feel triumph, not in that moment. I just felt a quiet sense of finality, the same feeling you get after dismantling a piece of unexploded ordnance. The threat was neutralized. The danger had passed. 2 days after she moved out, a formal letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. It stated that Karen Albright had resigned from the board, effective immediately. It confirmed that the illegal lien on my property had been expunged from the county records. It included a stilted, lawyer-drafted apology for the misunderstanding. The battle was over. The war was won. The fuse that Karen herself had lit with her threat against my goats had finally reached its charge, and the resulting explosion had demolished her entire world, leaving the foundations of the community and my land intact. With Karen gone, a palpable sense of relief settled over Oakwood Estates. It was like a long, oppressive fever had broken. People started talking to each other again, not in hushed, fearful whispers, but in open, friendly conversation. The neighborhood, which had felt so sterile and tense, began to breathe. An interim board was quickly elected, with Mark Miller as the new president, Jessica as the treasurer, and George as a senior advisor. They were good, sensible people who understood that the HOA's role was to serve the community, not to rule it. Their first official act was to formally accept the terms of my notice to cure. They hired an independent forensic accounting firm to conduct a full audit of the past 5 years of finances. They terminated the contract with Prestige Scapes LLC and put the landscaping services out for a competitive, transparent bidding process. They drafted a letter signed by the entire interim board offering me a formal and sincere apology on behalf of the community. But the biggest task was renegotiating the ground lease. David Chen and I met with the new board and their attorney in the clubhouse. The atmosphere could not have been more different from my previous visits. There was no tension, no hostility. It was a collaborative problem-solving session. "We're not here to punish you," I told them. "I don't want your homes. I want what my family and I came here for in the first place. Peace and quiet. And I want to ensure you all have the security you deserve." We worked together for several weeks. David drafted a new 50-year ground lease agreement. It was fair and modern, with clear terms and protections for both the lessor and the lessees. It included a modest, predictable schedule for rent increases, tied to inflation, ensuring the HOA's dues would remain stable. It also contained a good neighbor clause, a simple agreement to communicate respectfully and resolve disputes amicably, a direct response to Karen's confrontational tactics. The new board also took on the monumental task of rewriting the HOA covenants. They held town halls, solicited feedback from every resident, and worked to strip out the ridiculous, draconian rules Karen had so enjoyed weaponizing. The new rules were based on common sense, focusing on health and safety rather than aesthetic tyranny. The beige mailboxes were no longer mandatory. Children's toys were no longer a finable offense. And the widow at number 22 was officially encouraged to replant her prize-winning roses. The community was healing itself, and it was a remarkable thing to witness. The forensic audit uncovered the full extent of Karen's graft. The evidence was turned over to the district attorney's office. While I didn't follow the case closely, I later heard that both Karen and her brother-in-law were indicted on charges of fraud and embezzlement. They eventually took a plea deal to avoid jail time, which included paying significant restitution back into the HOA's reserve fund. Her downfall was total and complete, a self-inflicted wound brought on by her own insatiable ego. Months passed, the seasons turned. The line of pink survey flags faded and was eventually removed. Their purpose served. The new landscaping company, a local family-run business, did a beautiful job maintaining the common areas without pillaging the treasury. The ugly fountain at the entrance was removed, replaced by a simple, elegant sign in a garden of native plants. One warm summer evening, I was standing on the ridge near my home, looking out over the valley. Sarah came and stood beside me, wrapping her arm around my waist. Below us, the lights of Oakwood Estates twinkled in the dusk. It looked peaceful. It looked like a neighborhood. "You're quiet," she said. "Just thinking," I replied, "about how one person's anger can hold 60 families hostage, and how easily it all falls apart when people decide to stand up." Down in the pasture, I could see the faint shapes of Daisy and Buttercup, contentedly grazing on a patch of honeysuckle near the old fence line. They were the unwitting catalyst for the whole affair, two little goats who had no idea they had helped topple a tyrant. A car horn honked softly from down the hill. It was George, waving from his driveway as he headed out for the evening. His front yard was once again a riot of color, his wife's rose garden more magnificent than ever. I waved back. The peace I had sought when I bought this land had been threatened, but in the end, the fight to protect it had made it stronger. It had forged a community out of a subdivision and replaced a bully's reign with a covenant of neighbors. I had learned that true ownership isn't just about a deed or a title. It's about stewardship, it's about responsibility, and sometimes it's about having the strength to stand your ground, calmly and without compromise, until the bullies of the world finally realize they're standing on it too.